I have not lost my love and hunger for writing, and in particular, being allowed to refine the work and try to make it sing, try to give it rhythm, try to take it beyond just a story.
This is Who's This For, a communicators podcast. Each week I talk with writers, musicians, media makers, and more to get a glimpse at how they craft messages that connect. And now, here's the show. Well, thank you. Right there, you sitting by your car radio listening to this podcast. Thank you for joining. Who's this for? I am so glad to be joined today by a author, a humorist, a MC extraordinaire, a musician, and someone that I wrote the following about way back in 2014. They're the kind of author that makes you scrap your lead sentence 5 times when you write about them. Their prose is so full of poignant adjectives, it's like a silage-stuffed silo at the end of the autumn. Warm, pungent, and ready to nourish. I want to welcome to the show, Michael Perry. How are you doing, Mike?
Hey, it's great to be here. Yeah. I like that there's a silo reference. I used to have to unload the silo by hand because Dad didn't have one of them automatic silo unloaders. He had what he called an Armstrong. Was use my arm strength to throw the silage down by hand.
Oh, jeez. That smell, though, there's nothing like that smell. Beer is close, but it's not at all the wonder that is the smell of corn silage, especially.
Yeah, a little bit of fermentation, and then we had two old wooden silos too. They were built way back, I think, in the early 1900s, and they had nails all the way around them. And you'd go to throw down silage in January, and every one of those little nail heads had a burst of frost coming off it. Things were rough, man. This is why when I'm on book tour signing books and people will say, "Oh, you must be really tired," I go, "Oh, no, that could be logging. It could be."
I don't know. I don't want to say this for certainty, but I might be your first interviewer ever who's fallen through a haymow floor. So,
oh yeah, that can happen. I saw someone once who put their foot through and scraped up their thigh pretty good. We used to play in the haymow all the time, do horribly unsafe things with ropes, do flips off beams. I remember bloody noses and pretending that we were Tarzan.
Oh yeah, the 15-foot jump onto the hay pile. I did that one a bunch of times.
Yeah, one time, I think I wrote about this in one of my books, maybe Coop or something like that. We had ropes that were left over from in the old days when they had horse-drawn hay hooks that, so dangerous. These giant hooks, literally gravity dropped from the sky. And that's how, Anyway, there were remnants of that in these ropes and these big, tall haymows. And there was a drought year when nothing grew. And so my dad chopped everything. He chopped all the corn stalks and everything and blew them up into the haymow just to have something to feed the cows in the winter. And so there was this giant pile of chopped corn stalks. And we used that as our trampoline. It didn't bounce, but you could just dive off into it. And I remember doing a reverse flip off the rope, and I think it was supposed to be a double gainer, and I did a 1.5 or something. And I just remember smashing my knee into my nose and then laying there looking at the ceiling and the blood running off both sides. And then my brother leaning over me and laughing because that's how we handled pain.
Oh yeah.
Nothing's funnier than somebody getting hurt.
Oh, you gotta laugh it off because it's gonna be. I know in my in life anyway, it was gonna be a problem once I brought it to mom and dad. So,
and my dad, who actually was a very gentle, thoughtful man, and I had wonderful parents. I had a very, very, very solid and loving childhood, but he also was not into theatrics or silliness. And I remember him when it came to sports. I played football, and he told me, I said something about, I got hit last night and my arm is sore or something. And he said, unless there's blood or broken bones, I don't want to hear about it. Anyway, so that all led to the life of being a reflective, thoughtful, philosophical writer.
I love that. This is a good lead into my first question, so thank you. I was actually gonna get started. I'll even ask it just the way I was going to. So for years now, or for years, I ran concerts. I've done almost every part of a concert. I've ran the sound. I booked the show. I have pretty much done everything but performed. And in the last few years, I've realized that like when I just like go to a concert as Scott, go into a concert buying a ticket, I have to shut off noticing the level of sound or if people got through the door quickly, etc. You're one of the most from what I read when I read your writing, you're one of the most thoughtful writers I've ever seen, one of the most detailed about like sense of place, about how people work with one another, about how everyone interconnects. My first question is, do you ever like have to shut that off when you're just going to like a family reunion or something?
I mean, yes and no. I think the no part is this just happened to me yesterday. Someone sends me an email and then they freak out. They say, "Oh, I sending an email to a writer and I bet I made mistakes or I had to rewrite it." And I just go, "Man, you should see my emails. They're full and listen to me talk. I mean, me talking is a rough draft." So I have that very blue collar mangled English because I'm comfortable with that. When I'm dropping gerunds, it's not because I'm trying to get elected. It's because that's how I was raised. And yet I've developed a profound and grateful appreciation for beauty and art and precision and, the rhythm of the syllable and the fascinating uncommon word. I love that stuff. So on the one hand, I shut it off way less than people think, self-conscious about what they write around me when in fact, my rough drafts are awful. On the flip side, yeah, the one thing, I mean, this is going back a ways, but I remember, boy, I knew nothing about the stage. I knew nothing about performing. I was not, I didn't learn guitar chords till I was in my late 30s. But I very accidentally, a story that's too long to get into here, but very accidentally,
Oh, it's a
ear-
podcast.
early in my writing career, I wound up writing about country music. And the very short version is that I had written one article about country music once, and a national magazine called me out of the blue and said, "Are you the guy who writes about country music?" And I said, "Yes, I am. And it's lucky you caught me." That one phone call led to a decade of music related work. It led to me touring with major country music stars. It led to me writing about truckers who haul stages around the country. I mean, everything you can think of having to do with performance. It also led to me watching, I think hundreds, I don't know if I'm exaggerating, but probably hundreds of concerts as a reviewer, and then watching concerts from the wings and backstage. And so as a result, I remember when I was really doing a lot of that, that yeah, you'd go to a show and it wasn't a negative thing even, but you definitely were noticing things that you never would have noticed if you hadn't worked at it from the other angle or seen so many shows. I remember one of the ones, the late John Prine. I went to see him at a show, and he was out. It was him, and I think a bass player, a lead guitar player, and I think a drummer. And it was, of course, amazing and wonderful. And he was one of my biggest writing influences. Um, but John Prine was a heavy smoker, and he would do a song, and then he'd reach back to his amp, and there was a cigarette there in a little ashtray, and he'd take a drag on it, tell a little story, and head into the next song. And about 8 or 9 songs in, I noticed that he'd taken a drag off that cigarette for 9 songs straight, and I thought, "Man, what's the deal? Is it a magic cigarette? What's going on?" And then, of course, then I started watching with my production eyes, and sure enough, he'd get to the last verse, and I'd see this guy in cargo shirts and a black T-shirt s sneaking out low profile with a lit cigarette that he'd put up in the ashtray that he had lit off stage and was placing for John, to get a drag on. So it wasn't that it was an endless cigarette, it was that there was someone there tending the cigarettes. So that's the kind of thing that I think I probably never would have noticed or thought to look for if I hadn't spent so much time looking. My other favorite story about knowing how things work as opposed to how people perceive them. Everybody I ever talked to, whether they're a public speaker or whether they're in a band, my own daughter, I taught her this when she started performing. I just said, listen, I just spoke at the Tucson Festival of Books out in Tucson, and it was in a big old tent, like a 200-seat tent, and they do a great job out there, including they have really good sound, which is so many speaking or reading events, folks don't think that through, and they have great sound, and they actually have a sound person with a little board off to the side of the stage working. And I started off by just saying, "Hey, before we get started here, I want you all to applaud the most important person in the room, that guy." And then I said, what I've told everybody, you have to be good to the sound person because they have a suck button. And the suck button is what people don't understand. They'll go to a show and say the band sounded awful. Now, it's possible the band didn't play well or they did sound awful, but it's also possible that it was the room sound. It was nothing to do with the band. And so my favorite story about that is I was out on tour with a country music singer. And of course, there's a very famous bluegrass player named Ricky Skaggs,
Oh, yeah.
legendary. Yeah. And I was not out with him, but the guy who was running front of house sound, or the sound that you hear when you're in the audience, I talked to him after, and he used to work for Ricky Skaggs, who was a bluegrass player. And he talked about how hard this particular room we were in that night, how hard it was to get the sound right. And then he told me his favorite sound story. He said one time he mixed Ricky Skaggs, and after the concert, an elderly lady approached him, and she was just trembling with rage. And she said, "Young man, I own every one of Mr. Skaggs's records, and none of them is that loud." Just, well, that's not really how it works, ma'am, but thanks for your input. So that's like a 15-minute answer to your question.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's not that I can very much enjoy a show, but you definitely pick up on things that I pick up on things now that I didn't before. I used to be on stage or observe performers from up close.
It's interesting because I honestly didn't know this much about your being a music journalist from early in your writing career. I'm formulating a question right now. What did that bring into your early, like, memoir career? Do you think that there was something from watching shows and writing about them in there?
Yeah, I don't know that it contributed so much to the memoirs, but what it really helped, there were 2 things that it helped with. One was for years it paid the rent.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I didn't see coming, because as I said, I never picked up a guitar till I was in, well, I picked it up a few times and could never learn a D chord. And then finally, somehow, I had a dear friend, late Al Ross, taught me a D chord.
Mm.
And from there, I just learned 2 more, and that was enough. But what all that country music writing helped me with was when I started to perform, I had a little more insight about what it looked like from the audience, about what you needed to do backstage, and most importantly of all, how to put a band together and how to be the boss of your band without being a jerk, but also making sure, and, there are band members that play with me in my community, so, you maybe interview them and see if they agree, because maybe I'm not doing the job I think I am, but I just learned so much about band cohesion, and I learned about, if you ever see me play music live, I'm very deferential to the band because I'll say I'm a singer-songwriter because I write the songs and I sing them, but I am a rudimentary rhythm guitar player. I'm surrounded by people who are true musicians who've practiced that craft for decades. And I always make sure to acknowledge that from the stage. And I think I learned that backstage because I saw some pretty big acts that the dirty little, I don't know, it was a dirty little secret, but maybe the guy could sing, but that was about it. And he was being borne along by all the people on stage. And I remember what those musicians would say when the star wasn't in the room. And so it's really important to me that in public, I acknowledge the musicians around me, that I don't pretend that I'm the lead musician. It's like, no, I'm the singer. And, it's my job to keep the show going and keep you entertained, but have a look at these folks around me. So that was probably the biggest influence on me was just observing musicians at every level. And then also getting back to the sound guy, observing all the folks it takes to put on the show and to just not stand there at center stage and think that it's all because of you. It's such a team effort. Even, we're going to go play a show in Amherst, Wisconsin at an arts center there. And, it ain't Carnegie Hall, but there's folks that are preparing already for us to show up. And I try to never, ever forget that.
I appreciate that. As someone that sat behind a soundboard for years, I really appreciate that. No, I think that one of the big things in general that people don't understand about craft is just how much, I don't want to say mundane, but like how much repetitive, like iterative work there is before you get to that like burst of creativity. Does that ring
Yeah.
true to what?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, you can't make a living off inspiration, or at least I can't. I should speak only for myself. Now, the good news for me is I'm getting to be one of those elder statesman people. Just turned 60, and the good news for me, whether it's good news for the rest of the world, is that I just get up in the morning and want to write. I have not lost my love and hunger for writing, and in particular, being allowed to refine the work and try to make it sing, try to give it rhythm, try to take it beyond just a story that you hear and to a story that you feel. So, none of what I am saying here is to minimize inspiration or that burst that you get, because I still get those bursts.
Yeah,
But yeah, there's no question that in the meantime, you just got to do, I call it the heavy lifting where you're just putting together, or when you're putting together a book, for instance, or actually even just, I got an essay right now that I've been hassling me for a month. And part of the reason is no one has told me they want it. I'll write it and then see who
yeah,
wants it. But yeah, I mean, there's just, I know what I want to say. I know where I want to get, but I haven't figured out how to get there. And so there's all these dead ends. There's starting and restarting. There's deleting whole chunks. There's printing it out on paper and cutting it up with scissors and looking at it and just trying to figure it out. So iterations upon iterations, and yet, so yes, the bottom line is, it's always tricky to say this stuff because you sound like you're hectoring people, but yeah, there's so much work that goes into creating a piece of art that is unseen, and especially, in my case, I'm totally freelance, have been forever, and so that means doing whatever it takes to pay the rent. And
yeah.
my I do voiceover work. I have a band. I do speaking events. I do one man humor shows, and but the thing that you'll notice is that every single one of those things, no matter what it is, whether I'm pulling up to a microphone or um, none of it happens if I don't get up here in this little room and do the writing, and that's the one.
Right.
So, it still is about just hammering away. Yeah.
I love that. So I'm segueing right now. And
Right.
the show is called Who's This For? And it's kind of one of my central questions is do you have like an audience person that you're writing to or that you're writing songs for? Or do you have that as you're crafting things?
So, I think the songs are a little different. The songs are just sort of me, a lot of times adopting a fictional character or a composite fictional real life, writing a song that may have been, the first verse might be what I'm feeling or experiencing, but by the third verse, it's fiction, whatever works. But when it comes to the writing, I think of multiple audiences. One of the things that I was really lucky about, it was frustrating early on, but it turns out to have been really good training. When I quit my last job and decided to freelance for a living, having no clue really, I was writing everything. I wrote used car ads. I wrote scripts for used car radio ads. I wrote scripts for frozen pizza commercials in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I wrote brochures. I wrote 300-word pieces about telephones for the local business newsletter. I mean, whatever it took. I wrote, for a long time, a certain portion of my income. I have a bachelor's degree in nursing, and I worked as a nurse for a while, and so, for a long time, several years, a fairly decent amount of my rent came from writing medical legal textbooks
Oh,
or chapters for them,
yeah.
and what I'm trying to get at here is that what I didn't like is that I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to just write beautiful, poetry. And so there was times when I wished that I wasn't writing about patellar fractures. But I also, in the process of writing for a used car dealer one day, writing for a pizza company the next, writing for attorneys and doctors the next, and then writing for a poetry journal or a trucking magazine the next day, I became adept at keeping in mind the audience, and not just one audience, but many audiences. And am I writing in the tone, the style that will connect with these folks? And what that then distilled down, and I always use the example of, I wrote a book called Population 485, which is about being a volunteer firefighter in a small town. And when I was writing that book, I always remembered sitting at my desk, and I don't use a lot of tricks. I just work and rework. But one of the things I did do consciously when I was writing that book is I knew that if the book was ever to be read by anyone, that some of the readers would be small town volunteer firefighters. And if I misspoke, if I used a term wrong, if I did anything that made it look like I was just pretending I was a volunteer firefighter, I was going to lose them. So I'd always try to think, if I'm a rural volunteer firefighter, does this passage ring true? But then I'd switch to the other shoulder, and I'd think about the person in Manhattan who just went, who was a literary they just went to a salon in Manhattan. And I'm writing for them too, because I'm trying to write beautifully. I'm trying to write good prose. I'm trying to address the poetics and the similes and all those things. But I also have to remember that they've never been a volunteer firefighter, so I have to be able to write about the gear on the firefighting truck in such a way that they can follow. So,
Yeah.
there are times when I definitely consciously think, not necessarily of a particular audience, but I have them in mind. I wrote a little novella recently called 40 Acres Deep, which is about a farmer, and it's one of the grimmest books that I've ever written. And that book, it was the same thing. I wanted to write a book that was purely driven by my artful feelings. That book is me. That's as close as I get to me being that long-haired poet kid in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
But it's also a very dark book about farming. And so I also wanted to make sure that when a farmer read it, and I've received lots of communication that indicate farmers do read it, again, I don't have to come across as an expert or I'm not up to date on current agricultural practices, but I need to get the feel right. I need for them to read and go, yeah, this guy actually knows farming. He knows the experience. I don't write like saying, oh, I got to write this so this book will sell. I obviously hope it will, but
Mhm.
I do give consideration to who might be reading it and what they might wish was present that I might otherwise miss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were mentioning that Manhattan reader, I was thinking about something else that I catch in your writing anyway. I've lived in a few small towns in Wisconsin, and I can tell you why, like, Amory is different from Lomira is different from New Auburn, and I think it was poignant that I could catch that when you were talking about a small town, because I think there is something people miss when they have this, like, hallmark cohesive small town in their mind.
Yeah, and I had another thought related to that I'll get to in a second. Yeah, I mean, one of the things it would be I would be overstating it if I said it was a fight. But one of the things that I have definitely had to deal with my New York City editors over time, and it's certainly in Population 485, is the portrayal of the small Wisconsin town as this white picket fence situation.
Yeah.
Now, I love the small Wisconsin town. That's me forever. Even if I wind up living in Panama, I'm always gonna be a small town Wisconsin boy. Um, but yeah, I would have to actually say, no, There's my neighbor next door, it would appear, is probably dealing in some illicit situations. And we see heartbreaking and awful things as volunteer firefighters that don't
Mm.
match up with Hallmark. So, yeah, I think uh, anytime something's portrayed too like that book, I mean, it's died down a little in the intervening years, but it still happens. But I used to get so many emails and letters from people saying, "We read your book about life in the small town and we loved it. We loved it so much that we've sold everything and we're moving to a small town." Now let's go bang on there, Spanky.
Yeah.
Because it can be very insular. It can be, you can be 50 years old trying to live down something that happened when you're in your teens. I mean, so I try to write honestly about that, but then undergirding all that is just this gratitude that I have that I came from Roughneck. I'm glad that I skidded logs in the winter. I'm glad I
Yeah.
grew up shoveling Commoner because it only heightens my appreciation for those times when I am in New York City meeting with a famous playwright,
Yeah.
talking about production. And because I always feel like somehow it's not an escape because I'm coming back here when it's over and I'm happy to be here. But I just feel like I kind of snuck into, well, I think one time I was in LA at some big thing and I was nominated for some award that I did not win. And there were 4 or 5 other very, very educated, very prominent authors who were up for the same award in the same category. And we were all asked to stand in this big room full of hundreds of people and say something about our work, that we were up for this award or whatever. And thankfully I went last because the other 4 people were very eloquent and very literary. And by the way, I love that. This is not me poking. I love eloquence. I think, I'm tired of things getting dumbed down.
Yeah.
But I knew that I couldn't match them. And so when it was my turn, I just said, "Man, I feel like I got on the wrong bus, but it's a great bus." And so that's how I always feel that the roughness of where I was raised only highlights my appreciation for the cool things that I experience. Now, the one other thing though that I also love, it runs slightly counter to your point, not oppositionally, but just complements it. I just got I guess it wasn't an email, it was a social media message, like within the last 48 hours. You can write very specifically about a very specific town in Wisconsin and very specific people who are not characters, they're real people and they're unusual, and you describe them very specifically, and those people are everywhere. And I just got the message I just got within the last 48 hours was from a woman who's a volunteer firefighter officer in rural Canada somewhere. And she just said, "I'm reading this book, which now is over 20 years old." And she's saying, "I just love it because it's our department. It's our town." And, that honestly probably is one of the sweetest things I can hear is that I was allowed to write in great detail about one very specific place that's very special to me. And yet that story resonates with people who aren't from here.
Oh, yeah. Do you think that, like, that small town resonates because people just they crave community? Because I have found similar things to the small town feel when I lived in Minneapolis and just went to shows for 5 years and basically found that it was the same 200 people cast of characters.
And that's a point that I've made ever since that book has come out. And I think there's a certain group of folks who expect and are sometimes disappointed when I don't. They expect me. Well, I know, here's an example. I get asked sometimes to go to small rural schools and speak to the kids. And one of the things that administrators will either imply or overtly say is, tell them that this is not a bad place. You don't have to just leave
Mm,
here. And what I end up doing is I go, "Yeah, that's fine." But I said, let's be honest. There's some of these kids, they need to leave. They need to go and find themselves. And
yeah.
so what I always try to do is on the one hand, I just go, "Hey, I'm a small town kid. I grew up on a farm and I moved back and I loved it. I had 12 more years back in my actual hometown. I've had now another 12 plus, not in my hometown, but in a rural area in a small town. That's my thing and I love it." And so, yes, you can come from a small town and you can leave and come back, or you can never leave and you can have a rich, full life. Don't let anybody tell you
Yeah.
different. On the other hand, there's always a couple of kids in that audience that I know that are, maybe they're being mistreated, maybe they're just unhappy, and their dreams may come true in New York City. And I say, go for it. Because to now get to the second point I wanted to make is that because I'm a small town guy and because I've written with affection and honesty about why I love small towns, I'm sometimes expected to just take the party line. Whereas on the flip side, I always explain to people, I was in New York recently and some of my small town buddies like, oh, be careful. Oh, New York. And I explain to them, I go, New York City it's just one small town after another from block
Right.
to block. I mean, I remember I moved a friend out there one time. I think it was in Bushwick, and I don't know Bushwick, but I was there for a week. And by day 4 or 5, the baker knew what I wanted when I walked in the bakery. And that's small town.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think, I don't this is such a cliche, but it's a state of mind, Same with sense of place. I mean, I'm known for writing based on sense of place, and I have a very strong sense of place for about 6 square miles in northwestern Wisconsin. I don't live there anymore. I live about 40 minutes away. It's not like I moved out of the country, but I've written, there are places in Panama, there are places in Wales where I have felt utterly at home. And if for some reason tomorrow I found out I was going to live there, it would be okay. I think we both know a guy named John Hildebrand, who's a
Oh,
big
yeah.
mentor of mine. And he really freed me up one time because I was really getting locked into that. I am the New Auburn, Wisconsin guy. And as you can see, I mean, that's still the deal, man.
Right.
I have a big population 45 sign right behind my head from New Auburn, Wisconsin. But he wrote something once about sense of place being portable. And that really helped me because I realized that I can love where I'm from. And I don't rule out that someday I may, if enough time allows and health, I may wind up back there. On the other hand, I might wind up somewhere completely different and yet feel at home.
Oh, yeah. I don't even know if this is a question. This is just something that made me think about. I have, and this is might be the near enter middle age thing coming to, but over the last few years, I've had these like mental snapshots sometimes when I'm in a place. Like one a few years ago was standing in front of the Atlantic Ocean on just a nice February day. Had a few in mountains, just like before running down a ski hill. Do you ever find that when you're in a just completely different place that you just get that, I don't know, sense of momentary wonder like that?
Well, I think one of the things that happens with me all the time, and I mean, I was just out in Tucson, it happened out there. And this is a pro and a con. My wife loves to travel. And the good news is I like to travel too. The bad news is my wife likes to travel and explore. I like to travel and then go to a coffee shop and write.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so my equivalence to what you just said is, yeah, I mean, if I go hiking and see something amazing, I have those experiences. But mainly, I love going somewhere else to write because I feel there's a physical shift in perspective. Some of the
Yeah.
best, some of the most, I was going to say best, and I don't know, we talked about our Midwestern self-deprecation not allowing us to say that, but I'll just say it. Some of the best writing I've done about
Yeah.
blizzards and Wisconsin winters and what it's like to look out your porch at 2 a.m. when big fat flakes are coming down past the street lights. Some of the most intense writing I've done about winter has been in Panama. I keep mentioning Panama because I have relatives from there. And it's because there's something about being utterly removed and sitting in a tiny fishing village in rural Panama where you don't know anybody and you can hear the ocean crashing and seagulls and pelicans are flying by your window and it's 95 degrees. That really, it forces you as a writer to really, really drill down into those memories and try to recreate them in a way that if you just have to look out the window and see a snowbank, you might miss. That's kind of random, but it's related to what you said, and that I find a lot of the wonder I feel when I travel is that it just refreshes my desire to write.
It's interesting because I was about to say you're a big third place guy, but kind of like me, I'm a freelancer. Those places are the second place, as it turns out.
Yeah. Yeah, the third place thing, and It's odd because I'm extremely shy, and I've written about this, and to the point of, like, if I saw you in the post office, I would get an uncomfortable feeling, and or if someone asked me questions in the grocery checkout line, I get sweaty, and I have a hard time making eye contact, and yet people have a hard time believing that because I do so much public stuff and I do stuff on stage, but and so I'm uncomfortable in, like, I like to go to coffee shops and write, but I always end up hiding. And because I sometimes will force, I sometimes, if I'm really struggling with a piece or with a book, I'll go to a public space to write because I'm so uncomfortable about connecting with people that I put up the cone of silence around myself and write. And I get more done than if I'm at home and can just wander off. Yeah, I'm kind of wandering off your point, but yeah, because the performing thing, and I've heard many performers talk about this. Me getting up and being funny at a corporate event, or being funny in a beautiful little opera stage in Stoughton or Menominee, or me getting up with the band, or me even reading from the heart and getting emotional on stage, which happens to me a lot.
Yeah.
It's all real. But there's also, I always make the joke that it's kind of passive aggressive too. It's the best place in the world for an introvert because you're in control.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm going out in public, but you have to give me a microphone in my space.
I have heard that exact personality when you host, when you're like the Eau Claire's MC. Like I hear that in there, like there, it's so crazy when you'll be standing in front of, like, or when you're standing in front of a festival. I'm just the guy sitting in the middle of the audience or in the back because I'm also introverted. But it's
Right.
so crazy how you're so you in that moment.
Though just the way you brought it up helps me see a little bit, I think, of what that is. And what that is that introversion allows you, and I can think of exactly what you're talking about being on those stages. It's individual people are hard for me, but the audience, when you start to think of the audience as one, then that's a little easier.
Yeah.
I haven't, I'm not quite articulating it, but that's where it's at. It has something to do with that. It has something to do with not having to look at strangers one at a time in the eye. It has to do with just, and it isn't even looking, because a lot of times you don't look at the audience, but you feel their audience. And then the part that really works for me is that I mean it. And
Yeah.
And once I mean it, then and that's why even I'm super stoic. I don't want to talk about my feelings, and yet I wound up writing memoirs. And I will stand on stage and start to read something or tell a story, and I'll get choked up because I truly feel it. And I think some people say you owe that to the audience, and that may be true, but in my case, whether I owe it or not, it's what happens. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's something in there. I don't know.
Oh, this is great. I'm just appreciating this. Half of why I do this podcast is just to have these kind of great conversations and get to talk with people I find fascinating. So thank you.
I think that
Yeah.
actually, I'll get to your question in just a second. I think
Oh,
one of the things I'll never forget is at one of the music festivals you're talking about, there was truly a crowd of probably 20,000 people, and I've never, ever taken the stage in front of that many people. And I wasn't nervous per se. I was definitely edgy, and that what I call a good nervous, only this time ramped up right to the edge of freaked out. And I wasn't concerned about going out there. I knew that it was a receptive audience, and I wasn't concerned about them being happy to see us. I knew they were happier to see who was following me. But what I was concerned about in that moment with the largest audience I've ever addressed wasn't the, "Hey, how you doing?" That's easy. I knew that at a certain point in what I had prepared, I was gonna get really quiet and slow, and I didn't know if 20,000 people were gonna go there. And I just will never forget 2 things about that night. I remember stepping out on the stage, and the roar of the crowd was an actual physical force, and I'll never forget that. But then what I remember is, I got 2, 3 minutes in, and I remember thinking, "Okay, here we go. We got 20,000 people totally amped up to see a band that's, waiting to come out right behind me. None of them came to see me." but I'm going to take it down and I'm going to get reflective and I'm going to get really quiet. To hear it was unbelievable, a physical force, like I said, to have 20,000 people roar.
Yeah.
I'll never forget this 20,000 people going quiet and just that silence and everybody listening, and then to be able to bring it back up again and then turn loose the main act, which is what I'm not sure where it comes from. You try to listen, I guess, to the audience as one and read it. And this
Yeah.
is
Well,
why, sometimes I do a lot of humor and people go, "Oh, you'd make a great stand-up." And I always say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is a little bit like calling me a musician." Like, no, no. I'm a writer who you go to see and it turns out he's funny. That's totally different than stand-ups who tell you ahead of time, "I'm gonna be funny." Plus they've charged you money and maybe a 3-drink minimum, right? And so to me, and, I make definitive statements like this and have to take them back all the time, but I think I'm right that I really can't think of an art form that is really more bare naked and tough than stand-up.
yeah.
Being a humorist, coming out, telling some stories that are funny, again, it's totally different than stand-up.
Oh, yeah. I could go into stand up for hours why it's daunting because it is that like repetition of something that you make formulaic by default to because you want to hit those beats and then get it out there. I mean, it's a lot like I suppose it's a lot like music though,
It
in a
is,
big
although
way.
the thing again, the other reason that I think stand-up is amazing is the purity of the audience reaction, which is there are a lot of art forms where, including me telling a story, I could tell a story and maybe it doesn't entertain people the way they want, but when I'm done, if it's in a nice little theater or if I'm speaking at a conference, I'm going to get applause, right? Whether I earned it or not. S- What I love about humor, and even my humor, even at my level, but humor, people don't lie about humor. They either laugh or they don't laugh. And
Yeah.
nobody's sympathy laughs.
No.
So again, I'm back to stand up, just being like that. It is all out there when you do that.
When the next time I interview a stand-up, I'm gonna let them know that we talked about that on this episode.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to circle back about, because I heard it coming up as a theme a lot as we've been talking, is the idea of people who've trained you along the way, of mentors you've had. And your newest title is Improbable Mentors and Happy Tangents.
Yeah. Yeah. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, here's what I had to go into this, and it's because I feel lucky to have lived in Eau Claire where you've spent a lot of time, and I've met some of the same people that you've had in your life, and I just feel so lucky, and to have met some of these people, and I want to talk about this book.
I think first of all, thanks. Yeah. So this book it's a tiny little thing and it kind of was born out of there's a fella who's a very successful author and he's kind of a motivational business speaker. Our genres are very, very different, but through a series of events and even our personalities and our general style of life is very different. But through a series of events, we've become friends, and he's just been so kind to me. I mean, he does not need to promote my books because he's sold millions of his own. But he took me. I'd never been deep sea fishing, and I was visiting him. He lives in Georgia and on the ocean, and so he said, "Well, I'll take you fishing." So we went out 12 miles out in this boat, and I caught my very first saltwater fish ever. And as I was reeling it in, the one of the engines conked out on this boat, and so we spent the next 4 hours idling 12 miles back to shore. The seas were rough for a kid from Wisconsin. We were never in danger, it wasn't like that, but
Yeah.
we had this 4 hours to just talk, and we were just talking about who helped us along the way, and even more specifically, who helped us. Well, I think one of the phrases I've used in talking about the book is the ones who showed us the way before the way was clear.
Yeah.
So, anyway, and we talked about this and he said, "Well, you should write up a talk about this and then you should turn it into a little book." And at the time I thought, maybe. And then I had a long flight home. So on the flight home, I just like made a bunch of notes and then we did this little book. called Improbable Mentors and Happy Tangents. And yeah, it's about the people that, just a quick recap. I grew up on the farm. I grew up logging and farming, and I worked on a ranch in Wyoming for 5 years. And I went to nursing school. I have a bachelor's degree in nursing. I worked as a nurse. I liked it, but I started writing and never dreamed that it was going to turn into a living, but it did. And so when I look back, I don't have an MFA. I didn't hang out at any chautauquas or salons.
Yeah.
Now, those people later came to be some of my mentors. I'm always so careful with that because I'm not anti the academy. I'm not anti-intellectual. I'm not anti-expert. But I talk in the book about the people like the farmers that I grew up with who taught me how to tell stories just by telling stories. I talk about my nurse's training, and people say, well, you spent 4 years getting a nursing degree and then you worked less than 2 years as a nurse. Did you waste your time? I said, no, because nursing is all about human assessment. And what is writing but human assessment? I mean, we were trained on a holistic assessment model, which meant, yes, you took their vital signs. Yes, you checked their abdominal pain, but you also listened and reflected and clarified when you talked to them, and you listen, how is there, are there economic issues? Are there social issues? Are there emotional issues? And from all that, then you created a nursing care plan. Well, it's the same when you write about something. If I'm writing about a country music bus driver, I don't just get his name and stats. I find out, who did he drive for? What did he do before he did this? How does he feel about it? Is there a future in it? Do you miss home the way the musicians miss home? Is it hard on your marriage the way it's hard on me? And so there's an example of where nurses taught me a big chunk of my writing skills before I ever even considered, because I was out of college before. I was a very well-read knucklehead, but I always just assumed that books were written by people from distant places because I never knew an author. And so, and then I talk about, I've been a volunteer firefighter and an EMT for decades. And I just talk about taking practical lessons from firefighting or EMS response and applying them. One of my favorites is ask the question no one is asking. And in the book, I tell the story of going to a call that seemed innocuous. It was a terrible head injury, but the woman said that her husband fell off a ladder, and I was the first one there. Well, you're trained never to go into a scene until you're sure it's secure, it's safe, because what you don't want to do, and this is in the military as well, as you would know, you don't want to become another problem. So don't just, despite what you saw on TV, don't go roaring in there like Tom Cruise. Wait for help to get there, make a plan, and go in. Well, I got there alone, and I see this guy lying in his garage, and I just went right to him and started he's unconscious. He's got a head wound, and his wife is there. And then I'm already committed, so I can't abandon the patient at this point, but I'm committed. And then all of a sudden, I asked the question no one was asking that I should have asked, which is, I looked at the woman and I said, "Where's the ladder?" There was no ladder. And she said, "Oh, well, he didn't actually fall off a ladder." That's what she had told the dispatchers, and that's the information we had. She said, "My son did this." I said, "Well, where's your son?" And she said, "Well, he's in the house." I said, "Does he have firearms in there?" And she goes, "Yes." And so there's just an example of where, as a writer, then, nothing quite that exciting as a writer. But if you're looking at a water tower and you're writing an essay about water towers, there's the obvious. How many gallons does it hold? What are the different, double spheroidal multi-column as opposed to the tin, the witch-headed classic tower? But also, who builds these things? Who repaints them? Why should you or should you not do your school colors on the water tower? What's the, and then the metaphorical implications, but the questions no one is asking, which is, they drive by the water tower every single day. They turn on their tap every single day, but there are a whole bunch of questions they aren't asking about the water tower. So that's just, again, something that I learned from firefighters and EMS. And so, yeah, that the book is about all the people that prepare us before. If it was a classic writing book, I would be saying, well, here's the professor I had who taught me about English literature, and here's but I didn't have those people. So, yeah, I was very lucky to be raised by the people I was.
Totally. That is one observation that I'll make, kind of rounding back to when we were talking about how you can find small town everywhere. I will say I have interacted with a far wider swath of humanity living in a small town than I ever would have in a city being in my niche. I mean, definitely, like, even in Minneapolis, I lived in the, like, hipster uptown land of the year 2000, but here in Osceola, like, I'd be
Well,
hard pressed if I had to do that.
I think that's a great point, and I was thinking about it even as, I've already defended big cities as small. I think this business of having my roughneck buddies tell me I shouldn't go to New York, or I was in LA for some film stuff, and they're just all telling me I'm gonna die, and I am gonna die. I don't know where or when, and it could be in LA, but that doesn't mean that I'm gonna just sit here. Uh,
You're right.
so I defend big cities and I find them rich and energizing. I love the energy of New York City. But what you just said is very true and germane to our discussion, because when I look back at those mentors, if I was one of the great disadvantages of being a guy with a nursing degree living in New Auburn, Wisconsin in 1995, trying to get a book deal, is I don't know how to get a book deal. I don't have an agent. I don't have anything. So all I can do is work with what I got. If I was in New York City, it wouldn't be any easier because I wouldn't have known any of the literati. I don't know how to access that. Now, come back to the places you and I are talking about, whether it's my hometown, whether it's Eau Claire, Wisconsin, those mentors are available. And not only that, you're going to run into them at the Quick Trip or the coffee shop.
Right.
And so you've made a great point in that there are a number of my mentors that I could mention that you would have known by name and still do. And it just is our good fortune to have met these people and for them to be the kind of people who share. In the book, Improbable Mentors, of course, I mention our mutual acquaintance, the late Billy Krause, who,
Mm.
Just a tremendous musician, very open, very sharing, played in my band. But also, one of my favorite things about Billy is I spent years on the road with that guy and came to feel that we were very close friends. And I don't think I'm wrong about that. But when we had his memorial service, the Moose Lodge was overflowing
Oh,
with people
yeah.
who felt that they were Billy's best friend because that's who he was. You couldn't, I would never claim him because you just look at the room. He just touched so many people. And yeah, if we were in New York City, I don't know that we'd have met our Billy. And if we
Right.
did, it still was such a big pool. That's the other thing. So much of this stuff is, it's interwoven and interstitial. And so you meet Billy, and then Billy says, well, you should talk to so-and-so. And then you go to the joint and there's a university professor there drinking who teaches Chaucer.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so, so you talk to him about drywall and Chaucer, and that would not happen to me so much in New York City. I'm not going to meet the leading Chaucer expert. You can meet the leading Chaucer expert in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, because they're probably going to be at the joint.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right.
Oh,
There's definitely a proximity advantage. Yeah.
yeah.
And
Well,
a proximity and ratio.
oh, yeah. Well, and Eau Claire is especially special that way. I mean, I haven't lived, I've lived within 70 miles of where I'm standing for most of my life. But
Sure.
like, I have been a few places and I have never quite seen a place like Eau Claire, and specifically like the joint where it's such a cross section of humanity just right there in it.
I think the advantage, and I don't know if it's the same or if it's changing. Another thing that I've really tried to pay attention to as I've gotten older is to not be the guy that just tries to make something last forever.
Yeah.
I've watched, some of my mentors, I've watched become, I call it the two Bs, brittle and bitter. There are principles that I think we need to maintain and cling to, but I also feel that we do ourselves a lot of damage by trying to make things last longer than they need to. And, we just mentioned the joint. I love the joint. I will love the joint forever. And there was a period of my life when every Thursday night I would be there. I don't smoke and I don't drink, and yet I would go there every Thursday night because that's where I could find all this wisdom. I learned so much about writing and literature and poetry, and also dumb Packer jokes, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
beauty of it. There's this real blend of discussion. But I remember a point when I just said, are you still going to the joint to learn, or are you going to the joint because you've fallen into a pattern? And I
Mm.
still love the joint. I still go into the joint and, smell all those years, and it takes me right back, and I love it. But I think it's important to be able to realize it's not your place anymore, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I
Yeah.
mean, let others in now, let others have this experience, and so I think that ties into sense of place too. It's like, are you hanging around because this is where you truly feel at home, or are you hanging around to preserve something that's maybe not there? And so I bring all this up to say that I'm now, again, one of the older guys, so I don't pretend that it's my Eau Claire, not that it never was my Eau Claire, but these confluences, they like true confluences. The river changes over time, and you have to let new channels open up. And I don't know. I've definitely felt lucky to be in that place, because it is the kind of place where you can. I mean, I can draw on my own experience. You wander into the coffee shop in 1998 or 2002 or whatever, and you say, "Hey, I need somebody to record something for me." And they're like, "Oh, that kid over there is broke, and he's a musician, and he's got a
Mm.
Mac and Pro Tools," and you have him record it, and then 10 years later, he wins a couple Grammys. Um,
Right.
but there is that, again, proximity and ratio. And then I know the point I was gonna make, and man, I gotta stop, but the part that may have changed, and this is why I got off on that whole riff about letting things go and letting things change, is that I do believe that 30 years ago, when I was first nibbling around the edges of that stuff, Eau Claire's always, it was a factory town. And I think one of the things that really worked for a long time, and maybe still is, I'm not as, in as tight as I was, but back then, you really could have a circle of people at a table, and one was a tenured university professor, and one guy had drywall dust on his boots, and then you had a woman who was teaching language at the university, and then you had a woman who was working at the tire factory or the plastics
Yeah.
factory, and so I think that helped a lot too, especially for someone like me who came from a very blue collar working class background, and I felt, "Oh, I can learn from these people, and they're not looking down on me, or they're not thinking that have nothing to contribute, that this is kind of an egalitarian situation."
I love that. And, what's interesting to me too is it's just a new multi-dimensional cast of characters there, like you're saying, with that permanence. When you said that, I personally thought, like, and this blew my mind in the early 2000s, but the moment I realized, oh, there's some other kid that can run the desk here at Cheapo after I'm done.
No, that's what I love about I hope I can live up to my aspiration here, which is I ain't ready to quit. I'm still
Right.
gonna crank out my stuff. But I hope that I can be the older person who helps younger people, yes, but even more than that, just like gets out of the way or opens the door. Yeah, go for it. I was talking to a writer earlier today who's, I think, probably 20 years younger than me, and I see a lot of me 20 years ago, and rather than worry about turf or what if they have success, like, hey, let
Yeah.
me tell you, I hope you do go for it. It's been a fulfilling life. So yeah,
I
well,
love that. You get to be now the mentor,
yeah. The part of the conversation with that young writer today, though, was that what's also tough is that people ask me all the time, how do you get published? How do you get an agent? And I say, I can tell you everything that I did, and none of it applies anymore.
yeah.
All the things that I did to quote unquote break in, which was a 10-year process, they don't exist anymore.
They don't, but, like, some things are only, like, a few years gone, like writing product demo or descriptions, etcetera. That was a thing
Yeah.
until
Well,
kind
and I
of
mean, I guess,
recently.
yeah, I probably overstated the case, but in general, just like I broke in writing for magazines. Well, there, people say, "Oh, there's still magazines. I see them in the airport." I'm like, "Yeah, no, trust me, there's not magazines anymore."
Right.
On the other hand, the there is becoming a niche for print magazines, for print newspapers. Some people want that again now, and that gets back to just one of the things I talk about in that Improbable Mentors book is one of the things the old farmers taught my dad that I then took as a writer was they taught my dad my dad was a city kid who started farming in the 60s, and rather than make fun of him, the local farmers really took him under their wing and were kind to him and taught him a lot. But back in that day, and this has all changed in agriculture for the most part, but back in that day, they said you have a herd of milk cows, that's your milk check, that's your main income. In the winter, you log because the ground's frozen, you can skid logs, plus there's nothing else you can do in Wisconsin in the winter. And then
Yeah.
you had a flock of sheep because on a good year, between the wool and the lamb sales, you could cover the property taxes. Well, the way that I took that into my writing life is that that's what corporate people call a multiple revenue stream.
Yeah.
And so in my case, that's why, I realized early on, I have not, and it does not appear that I will sell millions. So I can't live off royalties. I can't sit back. I have to keep going. And then I saw what was coming in the one thing that really helped me. Maybe this is a good way to wrap things up because it goes way back to the beginning. You asked me about what I learned from musicians. Well, one of the things that really helped me as a writer, observing musicians was digitization hit music about 10 years before it hit writing. And I remember watching what was happening as everything all of a sudden was going digital and how it was making things so complex and difficult for musicians. And it opened some opportunities too, but mostly it did not. And I remember thinking, this is going to happen to writing too. It's not going to happen the same and it's not going to happen as quickly, but I need to plan. And that's when I really started converting the books into live performance, converting them into humor performances, becoming a better speaker, because I knew I needed more than one thing, and that's why I have a Substack and why, a weekly, it's like a mini podcast through Substack. It's just one more, it's not enough to live on, but you combine enough of those things and do the hustle and you make a living. So that goes back again to those farmers all those years ago were teaching me how to survive as a writer. They just didn't know it, and neither did I.
What you did is you led me actually in to the landing the plane.
Oh, perfect.
Let's talk about where people can find you on that Substack and other places.
Yeah, I mean, the number one easiest thing to do is just go to my website, which is not michaelperry.com, because many, many years ago when I first wanted to get a website, someone squatted on michaelperry.com. His name is Michael Perry, but he spells his name differently than mine.
Oh, no.
But he quite wisely squatted on my name too, so anyway, good for him. So I wanted a URL that would be different, and I hoped that people could remember. And so the best place to find out about all my books and speaking events and band events and the Substack, the weekly little podcast, go to sneezingcow.com. Sneezing and cow, spelled just like you would think, no space. And that comes from a humor album I did years ago where I rented the Unitarian Church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and printed up my own posters and hired someone to come in with a DAT recorder. And I recorded that live humor album called Never Stand Behind a Sneezing Cow. And that's probably the most profitable line of prose I've ever written, because I've sold t-shirts, canned koozies, that album, and then sneezingcow.com became my URL. So that's really the best place to go. And if you scroll down, we have a pinned post that directs you to everything. And and the biggest thing that I can say too, we're on all the social media platforms and they're great and we hope you follow, but nothing is better than the old email mailing list. And I have a link to sign up for the mailing list. And the thing about that is that, and I know I'm not the only one, you talk to creators all the time. Nothing drives you crazier than putting up a post and going, hey, we had a great time in Fond du Lac last night. Thanks for coming. And then 4 people will go, well, I didn't know you're going to be in Fond du Lac. And this is why we continue to ask you why didn't you say something? Go, we did say something. And if you're on the mailing list to know, So the mailing list is nice. If we just have your email and just a zip code, then we do, do a radius mailing when
Oh,
we do a live event. And then we also, we don't bury you in stuff. Like once or twice a month, we'll do a little, hey, here's some news. And then the only other time we really hit things is when we have a live event coming to your area, or if I have a new book or a new recording. Or I mean, I did just do a video for the Brewers. That's the kind of thing where we like to let people know, because that's a childhood dream come true.
that was amazing too. I love that.
That was very out of left field, so to speak.
Oh, well played.
I said it before I realized it. I wish I was that smart.
Well, no, you knocked it right out of the park.
There you go. I've mostly gotten through life on bloop singles.
Well, Mike, thank you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. We'll see you down the road.
I look forward to it.